Hey there, everyone, and welcome back to this shiny new episode of the Rumcast. This being the podcast that talks all things rum-related with the people who love and shape it. Today, we're pleased to bring you part 2 of our epic conversation with Richard Seale of Foursquare Rum in Barbados and Ian Burrell, the one and only Global Rum Ambassador. Will, before we get to setting up part 2 here, I know there was some really fun and interesting stuff that came up in part 1, and I saw a lot of conversation on the Discord about it. And what were your thoughts in terms of those conversations that were being had?
Yeah, I thought we had a lot of just great feedback on the episode, which didn't totally surprise me. I thought it was a good conversation and just lots of kind of new updates about Foursquare and the exciting projects Ian's working on. So I knew people would have thoughts. So there was one kind of question that stuck out to me in the Discord that had to do with when we were talking to Richard about, and he was expressing kind of a little bit of frustration with the idea of transparency, meaning you have to share like all the details with people. And in the course of that, one of the kind of exciting, what was a revelation to me anyway, in the conversation was when I asked him about when are we going to see the Foursquare cane juice rums kind of enter the chat, you know?
Yeah.
And he was like, well, they already have. And I was kind of like, boom, like, wow, you know. I did not see that coming, and I'm not sure like which exact release they started appearing in and stuff like that. And Shane in the Discord had a comment where he said, fascinating episode. One thing that struck me was how to reconcile the idea of know what's in your glass, know what you're drinking, with transparency not being the goal. Can you have it both ways? Maybe like others, I was surprised to hear that cane juice distillate is already being used in blends. Apparently, I have not known what's in my glass. Excited for part 2. And he had a little, like a smiley emoji. So it's this isn't a big controversy or anything. I think it's an interesting question because, and we had a conversation back and forth in the Discord, and I was kind of like, for me, I totally understand that perspective of being like, whoa, there's cane juice rum in here. Like, I would have liked to know that. But for some reason, I found myself being like, I think you and I have talked before. I kind of like that element of mystery that Richard alluded to. I like there being some sort of degree of secret sauce when it comes to rum or spirits in general. But there is a line that I draw where if there's something added to the rum, right? Mm-hmm. If there's sugar, glycerin, whatever that's in there, to me, that's where I'm like, okay, you have to disclose that stuff. However, I'm also willing to admit, I don't know exactly like why I define it there, as opposed to like, tell me 100% of like the ingredients in it. And Richard did say, like, he says now my rum is made from sugarcane, which that does include molasses and cane juice. But I'm curious how that strikes you, and if you have a line that's similar to mine, or if yours differs in any way, and kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And for me, first of all, I think it's important to understand that we all may have different lines there,
yeah,
right?
I think people do, yeah.
Yeah, and that's okay and understandable. So we don't all have to think exactly the same on this, including Richard, who's making the rum and he wants to do it, kind of his way. And I do think there's validity to the idea of like, the secret recipe, or, Coca-Cola keeps their recipe a secret, right? And that whole thing in terms of like transparency of what you're doing behind the scenes to make the product. But then also there is something to the idea of wanting to know a little bit more about how whatever is in your glass is coming together, right? And so it's a little bit of a fuzziness there with like, well, where is exactly that line of what you do need to say and what you don't? And again, that's going to be different for different producers. But I err a little bit more on the side of the other side from where you are, I think. Mm-hmm. I think I'm more on like, I would have appreciated knowing a little sooner. It doesn't mean I'm not mad at Richard, like I'm not like, this freaking guy. Yeah. But like I would have preferred to know a little bit more, just because I think it helps me to appreciate what I have and understand it at a different level. I don't need to know blends, percentages, and sugar cane versus any of that stuff. I think can be something that is left to whatever. But at the same time, I do feel like there is something to the idea of knowing a little bit more helps you appreciate what you're tasting.
Yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from there, and I think the way that I've arrived at what the line is in my head, like if I had to describe it, it would be anything that you would prefer to not tell people is in your product should be disclosed, basically. So like to me that covers like the additives and stuff like that, because I think for most people, or there's a significant percentage of people who would be surprised or would want to know something like that was in there. With something like this, I do agree that like it changes your experience of how you consume it, right? Or like your thoughts going into it, how that sort of thing, especially from an education standpoint. But I also think where it differs is like the context of where it's coming from. So you have an established producer like Foursquare that is regularly kind of like talking about the things they do and has a wide audience, right? And like if you ask them the questions, they'll tell you about this stuff. Just like when we asked Richard on the show, like he told us about it, and he'd been talking about the cane juice for years, and they'd done other stuff with cane juice. So when it's in that context, it's like, okay, like this is cool. Like I'm going for it. I totally understand your perspective of where you're coming from. Of like you want to reblur the lines of molasses rum and cane juice rum. That's this kind of weird modern dichotomy that doesn't need to exist. And historically, all this stuff was all jumbled up and mixed together, right? So I get if that's the goal, what you're trying to communicate. Then intentionally just saying sugarcane and not being like, ta-da, here's the first one that has molasses and cane juice in it. Like, I get the point that he's trying to make with that. And so when I see the whole context of who it's coming from, I'm like, this like feels consistent with the values that they preach, basically. And yeah, it doesn't necessarily make me feel like I don't know what's in my glass, I guess is what I'm trying to say. However, that might not be the case for everyone. And like we talked about Renaissance on the episode, coming in as a smaller producer and really making a splash with all the transparency and stuff like that. So I think there's room for a spectrum of approaches to this. And I think everyone, like we've been saying, has their line, right? And I guess for me, it's like, the line is when it's something that you're basically intentionally trying to hide, I think. And trying to define like who's intentionally trying to hide something, who isn't, gets a little weird, but that's the best that I've come up for myself.
And it's a fair point, and I think you're on to something there. The only other kind of angle I will bring is when you are as into rum as we are, and people who mostly listen to this show, I think your argument makes a lot of good sense. Where it gets a little harder is people who are less into rum and understanding the difference, right? And that part, I think, can be a little troublesome. Again, not like trying to, say that I feel like what Richard is doing is wrong, and I'm not trying to take that stance. I'm just saying it's harder to defend with people who are less into rum and into the specifics of this, of like, well, why is that the line and not this one? And that starts a whole different conversation, and sometimes that can get weird for people that are just kind of like, never mind. I'll stick to something that's easier to understand.
I also think where this gets difficult, and this is an issue that's just recurring in rum that we've talked about for the entire history of the show, is just how it's made in so many different places that people use this terminology completely differently. And you would think that something as basic as my rum comes from sugarcane would consistently mean the same thing across different places. But like the amount of craft distilleries I've seen that say, made from sugarcane, and their rum is made from some form of crystallized sugar. Exactly. Like that's a very common craft rum thing that I've seen in the U.S., which then, like, if that's an association people have, like, oh, I've had a rum made from sugarcane, they used turbinado sugar or whatever, and then like you compare that to what Richard is trying to communicate, and it's like, if someone associates it with that, then like they have a completely skewed expectation of what your rum is, right? That's completely different from what you're trying to convey. So that's just one of those difficult things when it comes to the terminology we use that there's not an easy solution for, really. But yeah, I think it's just interesting to talk about, and I thought it was a great question from Shane. So thanks for getting that discussion going in the Discord.
And it kind of lines us up for the next part of the conversation here, right?
Part two.
Part two is going to be also interesting, but maybe in a different way.
So in part two, we got into it kind of jumped off with the GI conversation in Jamaica. which, the last time we talked about that was when we had Christopher Gentles from the Spirits Pool Association in Jamaica on the show at the end of 2024. And many listeners will be familiar. If you're not, the kind of quick to get you up to speed, basically there's an ongoing debate in Jamaica right now about what the description of Jamaica rum should be for the purposes of registering a GI with the European Union, that essentially says this is what Jamaica rum is, in order to protect how that terminology is used where rum is sold in Europe. And on one side, you have 3 Jamaican distilleries or producers in Hampton Estate, Worthy Park, and Ray and Nephew / Appleton. And then on the other side, you have National Rums of Jamaica, which includes Money Musk
Clarendon,
products,
Musk.
Clarendon, Long Pond.
Yep.
And basically, the short version of the story is one of the key sticking points in this, how should Jamaica rum be described, is should you have to mature it or age it in Jamaica, or should you be allowed to age the rum outside of Jamaica as long as it is fermented and distilled in Jamaica originally, and still be able to call it Jamaica rum? National Rums of Jamaica is the one producer that is on the side of saying, hold up, we need to be able to age Jamaica rum outside of Jamaica. And there's all these reasons for it that they've presented over the years. But basically, the courts in Jamaica have stepped in and said, like, we're going to hear more arguments on this before we make a ruling. And that's kind of where it is right now. I think we should be hearing an update on that story soon. So It was kind of a good opportunity to talk to Richard and Ian about it. Ian is Jamaican, so he has those roots there and that perspective. Richard has been involved in a similar battle with the Barbados Rum GI that is facing some of the same pushback, and there's links to it in that Maison Ferrand, the makers of Plantaray, own 1/3 of National Rums of Jamaica. They also own
West Indies Rum Distillery.
Distillery, thank you, in Barbados. So the arguments they're making are very similar in both places, and there's a connection there. So what we wanted to talk about with Richard was he's presented a case, which actually... It's funny because we've talked about GIs for so many years on the show now, but I feel like I still learn things about them, or realize like, oh, that's a slightly different perspective that I wasn't considering. So we kind of start out just talking about, there's sort of a misconception of like what a GI is. Like, is it defining something? Is it describing something? So we get into that. And then we also get into some of these debates around aging at origin versus aging overseas, and like how tied up is that in history and traditions, and what have been the reasons for that. And it was a really interesting conversation of just like how you view tradition, and also what bearing does that have on a GI as well, right. which was something that honestly I had some misconceptions about. So yeah, it's a really interesting conversation. And again, this is a topic that's gonna keep coming up this year, I would expect, and in future years. So excited to add another chapter to the story. It's just crazy. I feel like we've been talking about these for almost the show's entire history. So it's just kind of wild to be able to chart all the various guests and things over the years, ways we've talked about this.
Yeah, and like you said, nice to hear from 2 individuals very involved in slightly different ways in this conversation, but still a lot of good information between them, and to hear them even get to talk with one another as well as us about it. So
and also, if you're just kind of like a rum history nerd, there's just some cool history things in here as well. So anyway, all that said, we can take a short little musical interlude, and we will get right over to the interview. Part 2. Stay tuned.
Part 2.
Well, on the note of all the Jamaican distilleries going into this Crossfire Hurricane project, we wanted to talk about the Jamaican distilleries. And, when we were emailing back and forth on topics to discuss, the GI came up. And in particular, Richard, you've written a number of things over the last year or so as the Jamaican GI, I don't know if battle is the right word, but debate has sort of played out and going into the courts now. And the last time we talked about this in depth on the show was, I think, the end of 2024. We had Christopher Gentles on the show
Brilliant.
Yes.
from
Good.
the Spirits Pool Association.
Yeah, great. That was a great interview. It was.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know. I can't remember if we mentioned this during the show, but like during that interview, Christopher literally accepted an award at a ceremony during the interview. Like,
Oh,
we
wow.
started, we
Yeah.
started the
This
interview.
guy's a fucking beast.
Yeah,
Gets
he
on
was-
stage in the middle of
Yeah.
an interview.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's just like, oh, I'll be right back in 5 minutes, and like he delivers an acceptance speech for an award, and
Yeah.
then comes back and finishes the interview. It
Yeah.
was unbelievable. It was yeah, it was like seeing someone in a game 7 just putting on a master class. But so at that point, the like where things were, the Jamaica Intellectual Property Office, they'd ruled in favor of the updated GI, but National Rums of Jamaica challenged the decision in court. June 2025. Fair Trading Commission launches an investigation. There's a complaint from National Rums accusing the Spirits Pool of anti-competitive practices. And then September 2025, the court rules in favor of NRJ on an interim basis, basically saying like,
Yeah, they didn't
you know-
really rule in favor. They just granted them the injunction.
yeah, that's probably a better choice of words. So basically they're putting a pause on it and saying like, we want to hear more in-depth arguments. And the last update I saw, actually, I think, was that everyone was due to head back to court in February, which it's February 22nd when we're recording this. I don't know if these discussions have begun yet or not, but it seems like a good time to discuss it. Before we dive into it, though, is there anything I missed with that, or any gaps you guys want to fill in?
So one of the when you reached out to me, and one of the things I obviously I suggested that we talk about was something I posted about, something I did at Rumfest last
Yeah.
year. One of the really unfortunate things for myself, and I've even stopped responding to spirits journalists, because the really unfortunate thing is people really don't know what a GI is. And Plantation has been able to throw these red herrings out there, which really muddies it and plays to a sort of layman's understanding of a GI. And there's also, there's good reasons too. The fundamental reason why people often get confused is because they confuse GIs with PGIs with PDOs. And a PDO is something like cognac, is something like Martinique or AOC. A PDO is something that goes beyond saying it's from here. It goes beyond and says it must be made in this way in order to have this specific profile. So when you make rum in Martinique, it has to go to tasting panel.
Yeah.
Has to pass. If not, you cannot sell it as Martinique.
Yeah.
That's a different. So what happens is all the spirits journalists are lured into this idea that the GI is a debate about rules and what you can't do and restrictions and constraints on innovation and all this absolute bullshit. All a GI basically does is says this product comes from this place, and because of that, it is distinctive. So the best way I can illustrate that is to give the example, say, of lager beer. Heineken has a brewery in St. Lucia. Heineken has a brewery in Holland. Ostensibly, again, I know the beer nerds might argue, but ostensibly the identical product comes out of both, because that product is not a geographically linked product. It's made in a sterile environment. The factory could be anywhere, and ostensibly the same thing comes out. And obviously non-agricultural products is the case. You can, build a BMW in Germany, you can build a BMW in America, the same product comes out. GIs are about products that if you took the factory and you lifted the factory up and you moved it somewhere else, the product would be different. And the reason why you have GIs is because in trade rules have to be extremely complex in identifying a single thing, which is origin. So if I'm building cars in Barbados, and Barbados has struck a free trade deal with Europe, and I ship a car to Europe, and I say I bring this document that says Certificate of Origin Barbados, and European customs say, Right. Certificate of origin Barbados, so it goes on to our free trade deal, no tariff. In comes your car. But is 100% of the car from Barbados? Of course not. I might be getting the engine from here, the light displays. So trade rules are necessarily very complex in how you determine an origin. And it's really done because of trade. When you get agricultural products, then this thing gets very complicated because right now, if I sell a product in Europe, Barbados rum or Jamaica rum, it is just a marketing term because as long as that product meets the trade rules, it goes in on the, and CARICOM does have a trading deal with Europe, and it goes in, and we have a trade deal with America, and it goes in, and it's tariff free, blah, blah, blah. So I mean, we worked many years to get that free trade deal. But I could have a factory here in Barbados, and I could get some Barbados rum, and I could import some rum from Guatemala and blend it in. As long as I meet the trade rules definition of origin, I go in as Barbados rum. Now, when I cross the border, that's another game altogether. Because in Europe, a statement of origin is not actually required. So I could bring 100% pure Barbados rum into Europe. And I say 100% pure Barbados rum, what we commonly think, yes, it was distilled in Barbados or whatever. And then I could blend it with something else in Europe.
Yeah.
And still sell it as Barbados or Jamaica rum. And so this is what people don't understand. They don't understand that the fight of a GI is about protection. It's not about, trying to define a rum. And when you look at GI legislation, which is identical to everyone who's signed up on the WTO, the US is different. That's a whole
We'll set us aside. Yeah.
Any single producer can apply to register GI. A GI doesn't define anything. A Jamaica Rum GI is not a definition of Jamaica rum. It's a description of a particular product made in Jamaica, which is traded as Jamaica rum. So naturally, that is the protected term. Doesn't mean you can't use the words Jamaica and you can't use the words rum. I give the example of a trademark. If I register my name Foursquare, doesn't mean you can't use the words four and square on your on that label. What you can't do is pass off a product as a Foursquare branded rum. And so once Jamaica or Barbados register their GI, it doesn't exclude anything. But what it does, it protects the product that it describes, not defines, describes. So one of the things that's out there is this idea that it's a definition of a rum and, it's exclusionary. It's not. It's about protecting a particular product. And this particular product that we are describing is a product that's fermented, distilled, and matured, and bottled. Well, in the case of Jamaica, they don't have the bottling requirement. And related to that misunderstanding, and this is what became topical to me. It's a misunderstanding I knew about, but it really came home in the Jamaica stuff with an article I saw in the press. This notion that a GI somehow represents history, and therefore, if I look under a rock somewhere and I find, hang on a minute, this happened in the past, so it must be in a GI. This is, of course, complete nonsense, because a GI describes this. Anything else that may or may not have happened has no relevance. You register what you are describing. And your product, of course, must be a product that you're describing that is linked to the region, that it can only be made in a region.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that would be so absurd. I mean, Champagne would still be able to buy grapes from Germany. Bordeaux could buy grapes from Rhone. Those things happened in the past. The Scotch whiskey could still put cherry Paxaret. Rum in Europe could still be sold as rum with using Jamaica Hyester rum blended with neutral spirit. All those things happened in the past. So one of these canards that they go out there is this idea that something that happened in the past must have this influence. And so directly with that is this idea that it's this historical practice of aging Jamaica overseas, that this is something that's gone on for centuries. And so I saw this article, and it was done by a consultant of NRJ, and he's writing about, this is a fact that is a historical practice. And Jimmy Lawrence, of course, responded absolutely correctly, irrespective of whether it's a historical practice.
Jimmy Lawrence is from the Spirits Pool Association, correct?
This is irrelevant. I mean, this is so what? But what bugged me about it is it become almost like settled, this idea that it was historical to age Jamaica rum in UK, and it is completely bogus.
Well, I think part of the reason, well, and I don't want to say, a lot of times when I'm talking about people on this podcast, I'm referring to like the small sliver of people who are huge rum nerds who listen to this show. But I do think among the people who are huge rum nerds, if you have been drinking aged Jamaican rums, in the past 10, 20 years or whatever, particularly premium ones, independently bottled, you've been drinking a lot of Jamaican rum that has been aged in the UK.
And this helps create this perception that this few hundred casks in Liverpool compared to 200,000 in Jamaica, that this is the norm, because you're absolutely right. If, going at our wonderful rum nerd friends, and the odds are he's got, especially a few years ago, before the rise of Hamden and then with R, he's got, 2 or 3 Appletons, but he's got 10 IB Jamaica rums. So his perception is that Jamaica rum is typically aged in Europe. And this, of course, is ridiculous, because these IBs are just a few hundred bottles each. The Jamaica, I mean, Appleton's a 1 million case brand.
Yeah.
And so I understand why this perception exists. It's just to confront it. And one of the challenges you have is that, we can look in the history books and we can see, Jamaica started exporting rum or started producing rum from about the 1720s. It took a while. Jamaica became English 1655, but it took a long time. Jamaica's not a very easy place get going. It's vast, it's terrain difficult, etc. It takes a little while, but of course, once the Jamaica monster is set alight, by the 1740s, Jamaica is shipping more rum to the UK than brandy is coming from France. And to the late 1700s, I think it hit something like 5 million liters. Then in the 1800s, Demerara joins in, and Demerara would actually, through much of the 19th century, ship a little bit more. But these are the two monsters going into the UK, the Demerara and Jamaica, because we don't know a lot about what's going on with the aging. But you can find out with this very curious bit of history, gives us this insight. So in 1915, as part of the war effort, they passed the Immature Spirits Act.
They being the UK.
Yes, and this was done to with the thought that selling mature spirits only, and this is the origin of the Scotch whiskey's 3-year rule. It was not done, Scotch whiskey guys sitting around and setting the quality standard. It was the government, and they set this 3-year rule for all spirits in 1915. But what happens immediately, and it's in the first act, is there's no 3-year-old rum in the UK. So in that original piece of legislation, they make an exemption for rum. They say rum can be 9 months, and we're going to give them an automatic credit of 3 months on arrival. Because, of course, it takes a little while.
Time.
Board and a couple of weeks on the ship and offloading and blah, 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 blah. And 1916 comes along and they get an extension. But they increase it, I think, to 12 months with a credit of 3 months. And they go along to 1917 and they get another extension. And they go along to 1918 and they get another extension. And
Sounds
they're
like government. Hmm.
because there's no stocks. And to be fair, what happens in 1918 is that you have there's a embargo on imports because of the submarine menace. And if you go back in your history books and you can see annual Jamaica exports, you see them collapse in 1918. That's the reason. So of course, with all this pressure and the armed forces are buying a lot of rum, so there's it's not easy to build stocks, but it establishes absolutely unequivocally the aging of rum. And what's more is we don't just have the stats, we have the debates and the descriptions. And so I'll read you. In July 1915, the Wine and Spirit Journal, which was lean, wrote that it would be favorable to this special consideration to rum. And this is the actual quote. They said, "Indeed, at no time have we heard of rum being included in the popular outcry against immature spirit, although it has never pretended that it reached the general consumer with any particular period of maturation." And yes, in the Commons, there was an MP called Ernest Pollock, and he said the arguments in reference to whiskey could really have no application of any sort or any kind to the question of rum, which did not require maturing, and that it matured as far as necessary in its transit from West and Eastern countries. So we don't just have these stats, but we have contemporary writing saying, well, hang on a minute, rum, we don't mature rum. Rum is not a matured spirit.
They're like, listen, whiskey kind of sucks if you don't age it enough, but rum is already really good.
Yeah, rum is good to go. It goes to the rights. So these exemptions are perfectly legit. But I also like to look at the other side of the coin, because I'm telling you rum wasn't aged in UK, but what was happening in Jamaica? And it's the complete opposite. Aging of Jamaica rum in Jamaica is huge. It's a big deal. And one of the insights you get to this is Edwin Charley, who in the 1920s is the biggest exporter of Jamaica rum. And in the Red Book of the West Indies, which covers all these companies, they do a little piece on Edwin Charley, just relating.
I love the multitasking. You're managing the
intermission
cigar
music.
really well.
And so they write here, during inspection of the bottling factory, the writer, noticing a pile of 1,000 cases addressed to Messrs. Law, Young and Company, Montreal, who are Mr. Charlie's Canadian agents, remarked that it seems strange so much should be exported in bottle at considerably higher price than in bulk. The answer was that it was not altogether a question of price, but partly because people were becoming more fastidious about the things they consumed.
Mm-hmm.
As an example, reference was made to Spain, where a bottle of sherry must carry with it the assurance that it was bottled in Spain. It was bottled in Portugal. The difference in the age of Jamaica rums is another factor that must be considered. Nearly all rums that shipped in bulk are from 3 months to 3 years old, while Mr. Charlie's bottled rum first matures from 5 to 15 years in wood.
In Jamaica.
And in fact, what happened, Mr. Fred Myers himself, in around about 1922, he then proposes on the same reasons, these health reasons. I mean, it's quite sort of comical for us to go back and read 100 years ago, talking about the health benefit drinking. He actually proposes to adopt the 3-year rule in Jamaica, stating that the stocks are adequate enough. But again, if you look at a brand like Myers in this period, they are selling rums. We know the Myers Mona, but they're selling even older. They're selling 40-year-old rums. And this is
It was a much different brand back then than it is today.
correct. And they actually ran an ad. This was the most remarkable, one of the most remarkable ads I ever saw. They ran an ad in 1934. They had gone about. In 1805, the then Governor General took a 60-year-old rum back to the UK
Wow.
And Fred Myers bought it back in 1934. Or he must have taken some bottles and bought it back because this is this amazing. So this was, nearly 100 years ago, their version of the 1780 rum. And so Myers, all of their advertising said Myers was exclusively matured in Jamaica under the eyes of government. They stated that supervision was a surety of purity and genuine age. All of it was bottled in Jamaica. They stated only pure water and caramel were added. It was all aged in oak casks. And back in the 30s, they routinely sold rums 5, 8, 10, 15, which they call VO, 30, which they call Mona, and VVO, which was 40 years old. So we have this amazing contrast. And you have NRJ writing and saying the Myers brand wants to continue its centuries-old practice. There are actual words in the document from Myers of aging rum overseas. And of course, this is completely false. And then, of course, the other brand of NRJ, and I think this one surprises people more.
We'll call it the other captain now.
It's
The
Captain Morgan.
captain.
Because Captain Morgan, what happened was the Bronfman family in World War II, when they were stifled with production, they decided to get in the rum business. And because obviously rum was one of the things that could still be shipped, and they decided to get in the rum business. And they formed a company called Captain Morgan Rum Distillers Limited. And what they did was, and it was announced in 1949 in the Gleaner. The announcement says, 1948, modern plant for bottling rum for home consumption or for export to world markets is to be erected shortly in Spanish Town Road. Plans for the new plant were revealed this week with the arrival of a group of Canadian businessmen who are connected with Captain Morgan Rum Distillery, a newly established subsidiary of the huge Seale Corporation. So Captain Morgan brand was established in Jamaica, matured in Jamaica, bottled in Jamaica. The reason why we have this separate Jamaica Captain Morgan brand is because of what happened in 1960. So in 1960, Appleton and the then Canadian interests were merged. It was not Myers, because Myers at the time was not owned by Seagrams, but owned by the Bronfman family. So Captain Morgan merged with Appleton, and to this day, go to Jamaica and you buy a bottle of Captain Morgan Jamaica rum, which has an unbroken lineage of being wholly made and aged in Jamaica. But once you had that split and they sold their Jamaican interests, Seagram continued with the Jamaica brand outside, sourcing from multiple places.
Mm-hmm. Puerto Rico,
in other
Virgin
words,
Islands,
Puerto Rico,
Virgin,
there was a Captain Morgan Demerara rum.
So you have two brands of Captain Morgan,
This is after
basically, at the moment.
1960.
Got it.
So today, the flagship of the aging overseas, the flagship of NRJ, 90% of their sales reportedly, is two brands for which in the case of Myers was a 100% Jamaica owned, foreign purchase and migrated outside. Captain Morgan was started by Canadians, but in Jamaica, and then split, if you like, in 1960. There's no centuries of tradition of aging Jamaican rum outside. It's a bogus story, and it's got traction.
Well, I think that word tradition comes up a lot. When you're reading the press, when you're reading quotes about this, and I think what I've found myself asking when I was reading the pieces that you wrote about this, Richard, and just reading the news,
because that's really what I want you to, the purpose is read and shoot me the questions, because obviously you don't know everyone's understanding. I try to make my case, but I want
so
all the people out there that are listening and have read it, on
Sure.
their behalf. Come on, shoot the question.
I don't think, it doesn't sound to me like you're denying that aging of Jamaican rum occurred in the UK at fairly large scales over the last whenever the Immature Spirits Act happened.
Yeah. So what happened is
there
the
were
Immature
stocks.
Spirits Act came in, and eventually, by about 1921 or so,
Yeah.
3 years, and that law was relaxed in 73. And so between 1920 and 1973, rum would go to Jamaica. And in fact, Percy Lindo, which was the Lindo brothers that owned Appleton at one point, he made the case. Oh, I think it was in the 40s. He comes out and he makes a big public statement, it's carried in the press. And he's telling the Jamaica distillers, why don't we sell it at 3 years old? Because the market's really bad there, sales are really bad, and our life would be better if you sold them this ready marketable product.
So then they don't have to age it further once it arrives there, basically.
You see, in the beginning, they make this rule. They're the only place that can suddenly overnight build these warehouses and stuff. And the reason I mention it as well is this is the root of the IB rum. So what's happened is so the reason why you see these IBs and you don't see them, I mean, there's this very odd exceptions, but you don't see them from really earlier than the 80s, is because they really didn't have excess, if you might, from until after 1973. So 1973, the rule relaxes. So all of a sudden now all these brands that are buying, well, shit, I don't have to use 3-year rum. I'm not going to use it. But you have these warehousing facilities. You have these casks.
Wow.
And the casks stick around.
That's interesting.
And so you have the birth of the very small, but you have the birth of what we know today as the IB rums. And there's the reason why they really only start from about the 1980s, smattering of the 70s. And you don't have a sort of continuous, you can't go back and see, Duncan Taylor bottled the 1950s Jamaican and 1960s and the 1970s. It all starts, and it's because of the relaxation of 3-year rule in 1973.
Yeah.
Well, and I think so. The question for me, I guess, is kind of a philosophical question of what is a tradition when it comes to rum. You have this, what seems like a tradition to me of aging for large amounts of time at origin in Jamaica. But then you also have this historical record of, yes, Jamaican rums did come to the UK because of this Immature Spirits Act, and they did age here. And there's sort of a relic of that still to this day in small quantities that rum enthusiasts are very familiar with.
A regulatory requirement rather than a strategic.
Right. So, like, what is tradition, basically?
Yeah. No, in other words, not really part of the culture of Jamaica rum making. A regulatory requirement imposed on a trade that was a couple 100 years old at that time. Yes, between 1920 and 1973. Every bottle that is sold there, all these old brands, the Woodses and all of these, they would have been aged a minimum of 3 years, as the law would have required. And I also like to stress, because this is where it also gets forgotten, they're also aging Scotch whiskey outside of Scotland too. Okay, there's a smattering of Scotch whiskey also aged outside of Scotland to this day. But nobody in Scotland would be writing down and having a debate over what is the definition of Scotch whiskey, and debating whether, as I said, one of the things that frustrated me was to see the headlines. And I thought to myself, put yourself in the other position. Imagine a Jamaican buys some shares in a Scotch whiskey distillery, and he challenges the SWA and says, I'm going to take you to court. I want to age my Jamaica rum in the Blue Mountains. This is the greatest thing ever. This will make the best whiskey. Would it be covered as a dispute over Scotch whiskey? No. But because a foreign person can come to Jamaica and start talking shit, the BBC writes, and all of them write, dispute over Jamaica rum. They would never, ever write that about Scotch whiskey.
But, okay.
Imagine someone comes to Kentucky and he buys a Kentucky distillery.
Yeah.
Is the headline in Kentucky going to be dispute over the definition of bourbon? No. It's going to be crazy lunatic has a stupid idea. And the point I would stress with a GI is a GI doesn't define, it describes. So if Jamaica registers its GI, they're still going to age rum in Liverpool.
Right.
They're still going to age brothers from Liverpool. I'm still going to sell rum to Liverpool. The only way that you don't see rum being aged in Liverpool as an independent bottler is if all of us get bought up by the Diageos and the Pernod Ricardses and all of that. We get bought up, there's no more bulk rum.
That's not the goal, is it?
No, that's the threat.
I'm just checking.
Because one of the perceptions is that these GIs are going to be a threat to independent bottlers, which of course makes no sense since the independent bottlers exactly work with Scotch whiskey. So why would they suddenly abandon rum?
Yeah. I'm still not clear on one thing. Going all the way back with the GI, you mentioned that the history it's fascinating and it's actually really interesting and to hear all of the knowledge come from it. But your point is it's irrelevant.
Correct.
So
but that's me. Every time I see the canard repeated, even though it's part of the argument saying, listen, it doesn't matter.
Right.
I don't want that to become a truth. I don't want that canard to be accepted. And it's very, and of course, when I read it in a Jamaican paper, that really, I mean, it's one thing when I think someone who's got a big collection of IBs at home gets the wrong impression. But when I see Jamaicans getting that wrong impression, because they're told from the outside, oh, your history is this, your history is
right, because it's a persuasive argument,
guys.
Right. Without knowing any of the other things, there is a persuasive part of it, as Will was kind of pointing about, a tradition, and then you start to influence people, whether erroneous or true, about traditions, and that all starts to work itself in.
Yeah,
but
you say this has happened for 100
right,
years. Yeah,
right, and then you start to gain that support because it's an easy enough argument for the layman to understand, as you're pointing out.
Right. It's very seductive for a layman to believe a GI is about defining things, that it's about exclusion, and it's about history. That's a very, and that is the cards they have played, and they're all red herrings.
Right. So I want to kind of try to put out some cards here in this conversation, which is, and Ian, you can jump in here also, but can we say then what describes rum being made? Because you've mentioned this is a GI is describing.
When you make a registration of a GI, you have to describe your product, and any single producer can do it. And one a GI differs from a trademark registration in two very important ways. So if I go and I register my trademark Foursquare, I'm the only person who can use it.
Yeah, understand. Yeah.
However, if I'm a producer in a certain area and I register a GI and I describe it, every single person in that area who makes the product of that description uses the GI. Yeah. It's one of the fundamental differences.
Right. And presumably you have to
this
have
is what
some
this is what we're going to see in Australia.
And then the second
Australian craft rum.
Yeah.
The second fundamental difference with the trademark registration is that if I register the Foursquare trademark in Europe, or as we have just done it, Captain Shadow, and somebody breaches it, all of the expense and enforcement of that is at me. With a GI, because of
it's a collective. Yes.
If you're a customer and you walk into a store in France and you pick up a bottle of rum in the belief that it is Jamaica rum as described by the GI, and it is not, the authorities themselves have to, in other words, they are accountable to the registrant. So if it's registered in the EU authorities are accountable to register. So Scotch whiskey, for example, which has policed Scotch whiskey for decades, when the legal framework of GIs came about, they said this is absolutely fantastic because this has saved us a fortune. This has made our life tremendously easier. And when Brexit was coming about, there was a real risk of kind of UK going the US way, which is not very protective of geographic identities.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a real risk. And the Scotch Whisky Association had to do a lot of work to tell them, listen, what you're risking here is crazy. And they ultimately came through. So, the registered GIs in the EU are still protected in the UK.
So what I'm hearing from you is that what describes a Barbados GI, in your opinion, and a Jamaica GI, let's say the same, is that it includes aging because of the nature of the area in which it is aged is different fundamentally than a continental
my
aging.
application says this is the product I want to protect. And this product is aged here, and it is sold as and known as Barbados rum.
Mm-hmm.
And I give the obvious counter example, or not counter, or illustrative example, of course, is Demerara. And this is where, because we are using names that are national names, it's easy to think that this is some kind of national definition or somehow government is involved. None of those things are true. Any single producer or marketing group. So in Jamaica, it's been registered by the Spirits Pool. Typically, GIs are registered by producer groups, but it's because of this naming. So, for example, if in Barbados it had happened that all the sugarcane growing was in St. Philip, now that's where Foursquare is.
Mm-hmm.
But imagine if everything had come from St. Philip and we were known as St. Philip rum. You see, we are a geographical product because when you look in my bottle, it says, Foursquare Barbados rum, Dolly's Barbados. Not every, walk down the supermarket and see how many products put the geographic identity. Yeah, there's something on the back, product of wherever, and imagine, as I say, if it came from St. Philip and it was traded as St. Philip, and today I would be selling you Dolly's St. Philip rum. And what would happen is my GI would be, here's a registration for St. Philip rum. But of course, being a tiny place, our rum is traded as Barbados rum. And as I say, giving the example, Demerara rum was always traded as Demerara rum because Demerara was not unified. It was 3 provinces. In the rum, so it was identified as Demerara rum. So the GI is Demerara rum, the protected term. So you could go, and if you negotiate with Demerara distillers and buy some bulk rum, you could age it in South America for all and sell it as Guyana rum, because that's not a protected term. So this is part of where the confusion comes from, because our descriptive geographical identity is the national identity.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily be so. And sometimes the way I illustrate the point as well is, imagine I created a PDO within the GI. And of course, this happens in France. In France, there's a GI for wine, and then all of the appellations are PDOs within that GI. So imagine we've registered our Barbados rum, and imagine it happened over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, we'd had our GI forever, or next 20 years. I develop a very distinctive style of St. Philip rum that only comes from cane in St. Philip and is made by a very specific method and has a very specific taste profile. I could then register a PDO for St. And of course, I have to have the fame with it. In other words, I have to have, the notoriety with it when I go to make this application. Because,
how do you demonstrate that?
So that's it. Because when you go and you register these things, it places an obligation on where it's registered. So you can't just turn up and say, hey, I've got St. Philip rum. It's really famous.
You have to be able to illustrate, like, I'm kind of a big deal.
You have to show
that
you have to show kind of 2 things. One, you have a product of some fame and notoriety. And 2, this product can only be made here. So as I say, imagine over the next 20 years, I developed this extremely distinctive St. Philip product made with a very specific method. I could register a PDO, and a very specific method might be, it's 100% pot still, and the levels of the cuts or the fermentation formula, everything, very like Martinique agricole rum.
Yeah,
agricole is the GI, and Martinique rum is the PDO within the GI.
Ian, I know I've heard other people talking about the Jamaica GI that they might have thought to do something like specific designations that would allow you to still call it a Jamaica rum, but it's aged overseas. So like different designations within a GI. Is that something
It's
that
like a
you
tier.
believe? Yeah, like a tiered approach. Is that something you believe would be helpful or make progress, or is that going to be ultimately harmful to the whole thing?
Which I think the Demerara Rum GI, I feel like has different
I think
designations.
as Richard said with the Demerara,
Uh-huh.
there is a well they've gone with a tiered approach. So
Yeah.
I just said you can buy Guyanese rum from Amsterdam and bottle that and still call it Guyanese rum, but with Demerara rum and Demerara Reserve, I can't remember the exact names of the tiers, but they got Demerara Reserve and Demerara and Extra Reserve and things like that. They can only be attributed to products that are actually aged in that
In other
Demerara
words,
region.
yeah,
Um,
you can have a tiered approach, but it's consistent with the GI. So I'll give you the classic example, Scotch whiskey. So blended Scotch whiskey can be bottled outside of Scotland.
yes.
Single malt Scotch whiskey cannot.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was chatting with the chief legal officer at SWA, he's a friend of mine, and I was chatting with him, he sort of explained the sort of the background with it. He said, you know, when we created the GI, there was a significant amount of Scotch whiskey being bottled outside. So he said that was a battle we did not want to fight
Hmm.
because it's very hard to argue the action of bottling is geographically significant.
Mm.
He said, but at the time, very little single malt was bottled outside. So he said, right, we're gonna lock that in.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so yes, Demerara has a tiered approach. They have two or three categories that can be bottled outside, and then all the big boys are, and they write it. They literally write must be. In fact, I can probably find that language for you.
But I mean, going back to what you were saying, John, in regards would that work for Jamaica? Um, it's always going to be about transparency, and it's always going to be because
Mm-hmm.
it will give the opportunity for certain brands or certain companies or certain independent bottlers to try to flaunt that because Jamaica is not as big as Richard was saying, single malt Scotch whiskey. As such, and there was only a little amount of whiskey being bottled at a particular time. There's a lot of rum that has the word Jamaica on the label that is being bottled outside Jamaica. Um, will the lines be blurred? I personally think the lines would be blurred
You couldn't
as
have
such. But
tiers. Couldn't have tiers where the product conflicted. So you can't argue, for example, that aging in Jamaica is a distinctive part of the product,
and then
and
give it to someone
aging
else.
outside has a distinctive effect, and then say this is a Jamaica GI. So you can't have
Correct. Yeah.
tiers which are incoherent with the GI. I mean, if you to have something in a GI that is flexible, if you might say, it has to be something which you admit is not geographically significant. So
Mm.
this is why bottling doesn't have to be, because you
Yeah.
can argue and say, listen, man, it means nothing where it's bottled.
Right.
Mm.
I got you.
Yeah.
But if you
Yeah.
argue that aging outside brings some other special quality, you have just destroyed the internal consistency of the GI.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
this is, of
Just
course, exactly what NRJ do. They come and they say it gets better, and it's more complexity, and it's cheaper, lower VAT. So they make their own argument destroys the rationale for including it. But if you said, listen, this aging means nothing. It has no effect. 10 years in Jamaica followed by 10 years in Europe is exactly the same as if we did 20 years in Jamaica. If you made that argument, you would then say aging doesn't need to be in a GI. But you
Gotcha.
can't make the argument and say, this is very distinctive. And if we change it, we have a big effect. And that effect comes from outside of the designated area. You have just destroyed the internal consistency of the GI.
yeah.
It
I mean, for
seems
me,
it's
Argue
the
against
only
yourself.
I was going to say the only type of tiered type of language I would prefer to see on the bottle when it comes to Jamaica rum is if the rum is distilled in Jamaica on the back of the bottle you can say distilled in Jamaica, but on
Correct.
the front label it shouldn't say Jamaica rum unless it falls within the parameters of what is
Correct. In other
defined
words,
by a
so
Jamaica rum.
Yep.
so to give the examples of France and Spain, which buy distillate out of Scotland, they sell their product in such a way that you will not be confused. So
Yeah.
they do not write the word Scotch whiskey. They write the words distilled in Scotland. And they also write the words product of France, product of Spain.
Correct. Yeah.
So if you as a consumer think you're buying Scotch whiskey and you went to the authorities would look at you and say, well, no, you're an idiot. This clearly does not say Scotch whiskey.
Yeah.
It clearly says product of Spain. And the irony there is these people want to distinguish their product. So they're not in an argument with the SWA about GI. They want to come and say to you, we think our product is better.
This isn't Scotch. Yeah.
Yeah, they don't want to mix it up. And so one of the things, for me with plantation is they've never met a marketing cliche they don't like. So they want to be Grand Terroir as well as double aged and tell you all the benefits of the other terroir. Well, you can't be both. And they, as I say, they never met a marketing cliche. They want to be every marketing cliche. They want to be, oh, we're tradition, but we're innovation. They're every single marketing cliche they like and they want.
Just to kind of tie this up, because something is going to happen with the Jamaica GI. There will be a next step with the Barbados Rum GI, I'm assuming. Is there any chance that what happens with the Jamaica GI informs the outcome of what happens with the Barbados Rum GI?
But what would happen in practice is that if you had the NRJ version of the Jamaica GI or the plantation version of the Barbados GI, they just simply wouldn't get registered because you written as they want it, you make no geographical link whatsoever.
So you're saying the application would be denied,
Yeah,
essentially?
it is impossible because
By the EU.
There's nothing in there. I mean, basically, according to them, the cane need not come from Barbados. The yeast need not come from Barbados. The rum need not be aged in Barbados. The barrel need not be come from Barbados. The water need not come from Barbados. In other words, and they don't even want it aged in a barrel. So you not only make no creditable claim to your geographic link, you have almost no kind of even integrity of quality. So, the reason why GIs say things like, aged, why does Scotch whiskey say aged in a 700-liter barrel? And that's just to have uniformity. In other words, if I say a Scotch whiskey is 10 years old, it not only means 10 years in Scotland, it means 10 years in what you and I would recognize as a barrel.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you can't take your Scotch whiskey and put it in a giant vat for however long you want, if you so desire. The problem is the communication. So you can't have a scenario where one guy is saying, look at my 20-year-old whiskey that's sat in a vat, and I'm going to use the equivalent language to describe that. And so that's what it's about. Again, and this is one of the common things we see, and we see it with spirit journalists. They repeat this idea that these things laid out in GIs are somehow some kind of constraint. A GI is a registration at IP office. There's no IP police come into your distillery to tell you, cannot put rum in a vat. What's there?
You can't put rum in a vat and then use the descriptor, right? Whether it be Jamaica rum, Barbados rum.
And say, well, this is a 10-year-old Barbados rum, because if we write any, and we do in our application, aging is in a barrel, cask up to, and we use the same 700 liters. And the reason for that is very simple: is that all of the historic casks range up to that size. Now, Jamaica actually, because they have only generally aged in 200-liter casks, they wrote on their GI 200-liter casks. I mean, fair enough. They describe what they do.
And there's always when it comes to GIs and it comes to standards of identities, that can always be changed if the producers get together and say, you know what, we need to modernize this. The reiterations of the AOC has been done since 1994 several times.
Yeah, that's one of the other canards that they throw out, this idea
Yeah.
you put something down and now you are
It's set in stone.
you're set for life. And then of course the PDO, which is of course much more difficult, much more complex. And yet Martinique's managed to modify theirs, as you said, a few times.
Correct.
It can be done. I mean, one of the challenges I know that is happening with some of the French wine producers is climate change is changing things. And there's going to be pressure to change some of those appellations. And I mean, yeah, well, fuck. I mean, if your environment changes,
What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
I mean, 100 years ago when these things were created, I mean, nobody would have. Hang on a minute, your climate's
Like,
gonna.
damn, we screwed ourselves 100 years ago.
Yeah,
That reminds it, Rich. That reminds me of a story of when America was flirting with the idea of reusing barrels for American whiskey.
Yeah.
And a rum producer in Barbados like, oh shit, I'm gonna have to start using different types of barrels. I'm gonna try some.
Yeah, I mean,
This is a bad idea, guys. Yeah.
so he referring to my buying of new wood, about 2007 or something, I can't remember. And it was because of these rumors were out there that, they were gonna allow the reuse of barrels, and therefore all of a sudden there would be a massive shortage.
Right.
Only way to
price
get
increase.
the barrel to buy new. So I started aging rum in new wood, which is absolutely horrific. I'll take my hat off to every bourbon producer. You're a very skilled individual. You have mastered.
Some of it went into triptych, and that's a decent rum.
Yeah, but Jesus, I tell you, that took me from managing.
That's why it was triptych. It needed 3 types of barrels.
Right.
But that was really. But that was it. I mean, I sort of proved my own point. That's something you had to learn. That was a threat. I'm an old barrel lover. I mean, I just, I got some casks at Foursquare 60 years old. And I just bought another set, 10 casks that are actual ex-bodega casks. And these were Palo Cortado. I mean,
I was going to say, you sound like a sherry producer. They love their old casks, too.
They are a decades-old cask, but, this is what I love.
Yeah.
So
I finally found the Demerara 2-tiered thing. So this is the actual, I'm reading this from the GI itself. The requirement for cask aged Demerara rums, special reserve Demerara rums, and grand special reserve Demerara.
Grand special, yeah.
There's a lot of superlatives,
do not only be fermented, distilled, and aged in Demerara, but to also be blended and bottled there is to safeguard the reputational and historical integrity of the premium and super premium value, which only result from the local knowledge and techniques of the production process.
Okay.
So what they're doing is they know they can't argue that bottling is geographical, but they're basically saying, listen, man, these are our most expensive stuff. We in Guyana got to do this. We in Demerara have.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's basically what Scotland done with single malt. They're basically, you have to bottle single malt in Scotland because this is our most precious category. And, we're not going to take any chances with it.
If you guys had to, each of you, I'm curious to hear your answer, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much faith do you have that this Jamaica Rum GI decision will be made based on the merits of the arguments? With 10 being, it'll be all about the most logical argument, and 1 being like...
money.
Yeah. 1 being it's not going to have anything to do with what they say in court.
6.
6? Okay. Ian, what are you at?
I'm a bit more optimistic, 7.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. That's good. That gives me some optimism.
That's only because I was having lunch with Joyce Spencer Square 2 weeks ago.
Every teenager that ever, well, no teenagers listen to this, but every teenager just heard 6, 7 and is going crazy right now. Okay. All right.
Well, you guys have hung out with us for over 2 hours now. We really appreciate it. We covered a lot. Is there anything we didn't cover that you would like for the people out there to know about?
We
No,
knocked down
I
3
mean,
canards already today.
we're 3
3
canards
canards
down.
in. Yes.
A lot of it's been covered already. I mean, you got the GI stuff in where Richard
I'm
is
surprised
adept
you have
into
survived this long.
who, me.
We are too.
It's still my body clock's still on the well. I've still got another 3-4 hours to stay up before I get onto Chicago time that type of stuff. I've actually got a seminar on actually a lot of the stuff we've been talking about today. I'm doing my presentation at Tales on the Road, which is what I'm going to be doing, which is why I'm here in Chicago to do Tales on the Road.
Nice.
Speak to bartenders, and I've called it Rum Rules. And it's not rules as in rules, the rules and regulation. It's rum rules because it's the best in the world.
Yeah, rum
but I do
rules.
touch upon, as Richard was talking about inside here, GIs, PDOs, and how it can benefit the bartender on their bar by just understanding a little bit of the types of rums that are out there. Because customers will say, is that really 23 years old on that label? Or why are you charging this amount for this particular rum that was made in Jamaica when that rum is also made in Jamaica is a lot cheaper without peeling away the layers that this rum maybe spent a year in Jamaica and then 5 years in France, and this one is 100% aged in Jamaica, made in a different way. So it's just informing the bartenders that the certain ways that rums are made will define the prices that they're being charged. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the rum rules presentation for bartenders here on Tales on the Road. So yeah, from a bartender perspective of why rums is the best spirit category on the planet.
And you should also tell him it works really great with grapefruit, actually.
Yeah.
Just plant the seeds.
Yeah.
I can't
Plant
wait for
your
you guys
seeds
to
now.
taste it. I might have to fly in to do a live tasting with you guys just to
Hell
you
yeah.
can actually try it. Or you can
Yeah.
always fly to London to Rumfest.
That way-
20th
yeah, we're-
anniversary, 20 years in October.
We're so
Wow.
overdue to be in London for Rumfest, and
Yeah.
we
Got it.
yeah, I mean we spent a brief amount of time in London when we went to Liverpool to meet the
Yeah.
folks at Main Rum, but
Nice.
yeah,
I know, brilliant. Ian down there is absolutely amazing. Did you meet Ian Hoyle?
oh yeah,
Or he's
yeah.
not there anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or-
He's
yeah,
moved
sorry.
on.
He's doing his own. He's got his own project.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Don't
Yeah,
forget
Ian-
that.
Ian Smith, we met while we were
Yes.
there, not Ian
Oh, yes,
Hoyle.
yeah.
Yeah. So okay, we've got Captain Shattuck, we've got the Rolling Stones project, we've got
Yeah.
the unnamed Probitas line extension,
That's
and we've got
While I was in Jamaica 2 weeks ago, I tasted a 20-year-old from Worthy Park. They're going to be showing off at Rumfest because it's 20 years anniversary. 20 years. They've been there.
All right, we gotta
It was
go. We
absolutely
gotta go,
delicious.
John.
Yeah.
It was absolutely delicious.
We gotta be
big
there.
Up to Zan. Big up to Zan and Craig for doing that bottling for me.
I'm gonna run.
Yeah,
Alrighty.
we've all got to go. Thanks, guys, for hanging out. We appreciate it.
Hope to see you soon. Cheers.
So, guys.
All right, bye, guys. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for listening to part 2 of our epic interview with Richard Seale and Ian Burrell. If for some reason you did this backwards and you listened to part 2 first, be sure to go back to listen to part 1. We'll put a link in the show notes. Go check that out. And hey, if you have any interesting questions, comments, reactions, like the one we read from Shane in the intro of this episode, feel free to send us an email, host@rumcast.com. That's HOST@rumcast.com. Or you can find us on social media. John, where can they find us?
We are at the Rumcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram,
What did you
and
say? These whips?
Threads. No, I was kind of going for like a punching effect, but I don't know. Yeah. That doesn't really sound like what it sounds like when you punch somebody, I guess. You're right. Maybe a whip would have been better. I don't know. But yeah, Facebook, Threads, Twitter, and Instagram. Get us there, and you can also get in some comments on our posting on our stories, or you can, slide into the DMs. Is that okay to say still? That doesn't, maybe I should
it's a
just
little
say
dated.
DM
I think it's a
people.
little dated at this
Yeah,
point. It's
yeah.
a
Well,
little
so
how
am
do
I.
you? It's a little how do you do, fellow kids? But I don't think it means anything negative.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean some slight sexual connotations maybe, but that's okay. It's all fun and games.
Yeah, well, we'll keep the sexual part out of it, but you can still slide into the DMs.
Other than the whips, I'll add another whatcha and say you can also join us on Patreon at patreon.com/therumcast. There's always a link to that in the show notes as well. But if you want to jump into the Patreon members Discord, lots of great conversations going on in there. We'd love to see you there as well. But with all that said, we'll be back very soon. We got some cool, creative episodes coming up, John. Some exciting stuff.
Yep,
A
I'm
mixture
excited
of interviews with people doing new projects. Some very interesting tastings coming up, and a little something of our own we've been cooking up coming up as the weather starts to warm. So a lot to be excited about. But we will see you all, or we won't see you all. You will see us if you're watching on YouTube, or you will hear us very soon. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.